This is American Government for Friday, November 12th, 2021. This lecture covers those part of the notes that I passed out at the beginning of the week that include Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of this last week. So I'll attach those notes along with this lecture, and we'll begin on the top of page 4. And if you're looking at the top of page 4, this refers to the Kennedy article, the campaign speech on the presidency when he was running for president in 1960. And the reason I included this in the readings in our course is remember, for each of the institutions in American government, we looked at the original design and intentions, primarily, with the exception of the party system, of course, because that wasn't part of the original constitutional design. But we looked at primarily excerpts from the Federalist Papers that explain how the institution was designed and what its core function was and what its necessities were. And then the second stage of all these institutions, beginning with federalism, Congress, the Electoral College, the party system, the presidency, which is what this lecture is about, and the last institution that we'll be examining in the course is the judiciary, to which we'll turn to on Monday. So, in terms of the historical growth of the presidency and the executive branch, the key word that I suggested you should use is growth. And I explained both last Friday, Monday, and part of Wednesday that growth means not only the institutional size, the size of the executive branch, which, as I've mentioned several times, started out with a president, a vice president, 5 heads of departments, and over time, about 50 or so executive officers, primarily in the Secretary of Treasury under Alexander Hamilton, and about 500 to 800 continental soldiers left over from the Articles of Confederation. So, the last subject we'll talk about, which was Friday's subject specifically, was the rest of the executive branch beneath the president and vice president, commonly called the bureaucracy. But to go back to the presidency, so the presidency grew in terms of scope, in terms of size and institutional, and when we look at the chartograph of the executive branch, you'll see it isn't just the bureaucracy, the main bulk of the federal pyramid beneath the top of the executive branch. When I say that the presidency grew in the institution of the presidency grew, you'll see there are several institutional clusters around the presidency, which are technically extensions of and support agencies for the president. And then we'll look at the rest of the executive branch. But I said that the other kinds of growth that the presidency and the executive branch underwent over 2.5 centuries wasn't just institutional size, but also scope and function. And if you remember, Wilson deals very nicely with this. It's tied with the growth of the government and what we expect of government. So, for instance, when we come to the 4 kinds of modern leadership that Kennedy talks about in his essay, we're in the midst of a period of economic inflation. We just finished a 1.5 to 2 year period of economic decline because of the pandemic and the policies of shutting the economy down and the society down in order to react to the pandemic. And the reason I'm saying that is it's interesting, really, since the rise of the modern economy with nationwide capitalism and with the welfare state and the regulatory state, for better or worse, we expect the president to manage the economy. Now, when we talk about the criticisms of the modern president, as you'll see in a minute, some people think that one problem is that the presidency isn't powerful enough to govern the country, and that the scope of the presidency is beyond any one person's ability to master or govern. There may be something to this in the sense that, again, we expect the president to manage the economy when, in reality, when you look constitutionally at the powers of the president, even as augmented by legislation, it's not clear that the president has the power to actually manage the economy. But nevertheless, we have a tendency to reward or blame him depending on how the economy is doing at any point in time. But this is an outgrowth of the idea that the business of government is to manage the economy, and of course the manager of managers is the presidency. So if it's a time of economic decline or inflation or something like that, for better or worse, for right or wrong, people are laying the blame for the present inflation that the country is going through on the Biden administration and President Biden. Again, whether or not that's fair or not, it's almost irrelevant because we expect the president, as I said, to manage the economy. That's part of the expansion of the scope and function of government, both with the regulatory state and also with the welfare state that arose during the turn of the century and the New Deal. So the last kind of expansion or growth that I mentioned was a growth in power and influence within the constitutional and political system. And I suggested there were accidental reasons for that, the rise of the mass media, which has favored the presidency, and of course it depends upon the media capabilities of the president. President Obama was a master of television. So was President Reagan, by the way. President Trump had a mixed record because he was a Twitter master, which got him into as much trouble and probably caused as much disruption at times. But then also, he was a kind of a master don't forget, his background was in reality TV. What's the show where you say you're fired? Oh, The Apprentice. But also he had his media beginnings. He was both a businessman and a media mogul in professional wrestling. So, as I mentioned, since we're going to turn to Kennedy in a minute, in the 1960 presidential election was the first election in which there was televised presidential debate. And what's interesting is I think I mentioned in class that Nixon, Richard Nixon, who was the vice president under President Eisenhower, was running for the Republican nomination in the candidacy, and President Kennedy was a senator, a young senator from Massachusetts, who'd been a war hero, PT 109. You want to check that out on the internet. And then he was a member of the House, and then he moved up to the Senate, and in 1960 he was running for president. He was he was at that point, by the way, the youngest president ever. And he was telegenic, he was handsome. My mother even said at that point, who was a Democrat at that time in her life, that she was going to vote for Kennedy because of his nice hair, somewhat facetiously. My point about the presidential debate, which was the first time in which the television had really become a major part of the campaign environment. Television advertising had sort of begun in the 1950s, but now it's a major part of all political campaigns, as we saw in Chapter 7 from the Wilson text on campaigning and the party system. But in the debate, those who watched the debate thought Kennedy had done better. Those who listened to the debate on radio thought Nixon had done better. And part of it was the physical image. So on one level, the rise of the mass media has aided the president because the president's a single individual. And as opposed to Congress, as we saw when we looked at Congress, part of the image that Congress has to the American people is that it's like a mud fight, or even worse, a rugby game, or even worse, a hockey game. That Congress looks like a mess because it's bicameral, it's a plural institution, and there are party fighting and everything. So it's hard for television to benefit that institution. It may have actually created the negative image that a lot of Americans have of Congress. So, but the presidency has benefited from the rise of the mass media, first radio, then television, the internet, etc. The other reason, in some ways, for the growth of the power and influence is because the rise of the United States as a world power. And therefore, as the branch, according to Hamilton at the time of the founding, the branch most capable and most for whom the actual governing of running of foreign affairs devolves upon, the presidency, it's not surprising that as the U.S. became a major world power and commercial power throughout the world, that the presidency benefited from this. So we have a constitutional system where, in some ways, Hamilton's expectations, as we saw in the great court case U.S. v. Curtis Wright, 1956, that I led you through in class, which kind of confirms the notion that the president is at the center of the constitutional system, especially in foreign affairs and war. So to get back to the campaign speech on the presidency, Kennedy argues, partially in criticism of President Eisenhower, whom he criticized as being an underachiever, as not embodying the four kinds of leadership that he talks about. I don't want to judge that question because, actually, interestingly enough, about the time that Kennedy became president in the 1960s, one of his advisors was an academic historian, political scientist, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who created a way of evaluating and ranking all the presidents. Now that we have 46 of them, and Eisenhower at that time in 1960, he just finished being president, was actually viewed as kind of a middle to a kind of a poor president. But in the ensuing 20 years after, in 1982, when Schlesinger recommissioned this kind of poll of political scientists, Eisenhower had actually risen in estimation to being near great. So on one level, I don't want to talk about, I don't want to judge whether Kennedy's evaluation of Eisenhower was correct. This was, after all, a campaign speech. But the important thing is he's absolutely right about the kinds of leadership that we now expect from the presidency. And if you remember, the last of the major tasks of the executive that we discussed in Hamilton's Federalist 70 in the Nichols Reader was what he calls bringing coherence to the anarchy and faction of popular government. In other words, providing a kind of leadership. So Kennedy's essay, a campaign speech, is actually a nice treatment of how the president provides four important kinds of leadership. And those four kinds of leadership are executive leadership. He's the head of the executive branch. He runs the executive branch. By the way, you could say that President Biden, in first issuing a vaccine mandate to all federal employees, that was clearly within his constitutional role and authority, since he has the executive power by Article 2, Section 1, the vesting clause, and he's the head of the executive branch. That's so the president has to be a vigorous administrator of the executive branch. That's executive administrative leadership. Second, although this is implicit in several aspects of the president's constitutional powers, he, after all, signs legislation. He can veto legislation, not sign it. And to some degree, that implies that the president has a role within the internal operation and the legislative agenda of Congress. It would be fair to say Kennedy is right, that now we expect in some ways the president to be almost the major leader of the legislative activity or direction. We expect the president. And of course, President Biden is trying to do this with both the infrastructure bill that was just passed by Congress and which he's about to sign over this weekend, and his Build Back Better plan, which would add about $4 to $5 trillion of expanded welfare programs, which you could say that what he wants to do great things, just like Hamilton said presidents would, and that and in his own campaign literature and his own explanation, he wants to be like the next FDR. FDR, the four-term president that introduced the welfare state, first with Social Security, etc., and then LBJ, the Great Society with expanded Medicare, Medicaid, and also family welfare programs. And President Obama with Obamacare. So President Biden wants to aspire to be this kind of legislative leader and lay a legislative agenda in front of Congress. So we do expect that. The third kind of leadership is interesting because, again, remember, the framers didn't imagine a party system. They designed the Electoral College to operate without political parties, but as we already saw, almost immediately the Electoral College was transformed by the rise of parties, and in some ways political parties, this is one of the points I tried to make when we examined the political parties, have become part of the constitutional fabric of government. And so in some ways, you're going to see that this third kind of leadership is that the president is also the leader of his party. There are national committees that run both the Republican and Democratic parties and even minor parties. And so there's technically a chair of the Republican National Committee. There's a chair of the Democratic National Committee. There are party leaders in Congress, the majority leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, the minority leader, Mitch McConnell. There's Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and there's Kevin McCarthy, who's the minority leader. So, and even certain governors like Ron DeSantis or Gavin Newsom, Ron DeSantis, the Republican governor of Florida, and Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor of those are national party leaders, party figures. But Kennedy is right. We expect now the president to really be the head of his party, her party. And the reason I asked you to look at that Wall Street Journal article about the four parties in Congress, you might look at that by Gerald Seib, is it shows how how in some ways the Congress and the parties need presidential leadership, but why it might be difficult for President Biden right now to lead the Democratic Party, and whoever becomes the Republican Party candidate in 2024, whether it's Trump or somebody else, the difficulty is because there are actually two Republican parties, a kind of a Trump populist party and a conventional Republican party. And then in the party structure within Congress right now, in the Democratic Party, there's the kind of progressive wing that's driving the progressive and liberal agenda, and then there's the moderate Democratic Party. And the reason they haven't been able to pass the Build Back Better plan, the massive reconciliation spending bill, is not because of the Republicans who are united in opposition to it, but because of the internal tensions within the Democratic Party. And so Saib's article is a nice portrayal of how we do expect the president to be the party leader and how difficult it is when there are major divisions within each party. The last kind of leadership that Kennedy talks about is national, moral leadership in the entire nation in terms of crisis and distress. I remember in 1986, before most of your parents were even born, in January, when the Challenger, the space shuttle, with Christy McAuliffe, the first non-astronaut, the teacher, who had been chosen to be the first civilian to go into space, and then, of course, in launch it exploded, and the whole nation was shocked. Reagan, who was a controversial president, he was a conservative Republican president, and yet when he got up and spoke to the nation, there is a certain sense in which even people that hated Reagan understood that the president was speaking for the whole nation. So Kennedy is right. These four levels or kinds of leadership are what we now today expect from the president. Administrative, executive leadership of the executive branch, congressional leader, a legislative leader, or influencer in Congress, the leader of his or her party, and of course the leader of the entire nation. Now you should know there's a kind of a tension between the last two kinds of leadership. You can be the head of your party, but you also have to be the head of the nation. And probably President Biden's presidency will probably be evaluated by when he took his oath of office this last January. And President Trump was a controversial president, no doubt about it. And the nation was polarized. Still is, by the way. Now it's vaccine mandates, God knows what else, maybe immigration. But there is a certain sense in which President Biden promised to be the president of all Americans, red state, blue states, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans. So I'm not going to judge whether he's living up to that, but I will say that historians will probably judge his presidency by the extent, looking back on his presidency, to which he was able to embody that last kind of leadership. And so the material for Wednesday was to then, as I said, and with all these institutions, we look at the original design, historical changes, and contemporary criticisms or questions about the institution. And you're going to see the criticisms of the contemporary presidency revolve around three kinds of questions. Whether the president is too strong, that's a very typical trope or theme in presidential scholarship and commentary. That we'll come back to that in a minute. Oddly enough, that the presidency is too weak, that the tasks, the president actually doesn't have enough constitutional power to perform the expectations, constitutional and political expectations we place on the president. And another criticism, and this is especially reflected in the Caesar et al., The Rise of the Rhetorical Presidency, which argues that the modern president is too popular. And we've seen in our section on the Electoral College and the party system that both on the election stage and the Electoral College, the president is now popularly elected, even if you follow Diamond's article, that he's elected popularly in the states through the Electoral College. But that now, with the party system reforms, the president is nominated. So on every level of the election, the president has to build a popular following. And then you'll see the essence of this Caesar et al. Article, The Rise of the Rhetorical Presidency, is that the president now has to govern through popular crowd-raising rhetoric, which means that the power of the presidency may expand even more and pose a challenge to the constitutional system, or that if the president fails to summon this kind of crowd-raising rhetoric, it may undermine his power. By the way, that may be a problem with President Biden right now. I'm not judging that issue, but people argue that he may not be Perhaps he's senile, or that's one of the criticisms. I'm not judging that question. All I mean to say is there's no question that compared to a Reagan or an Obama, even a Trump at times, that President Biden doesn't seem to have the ability to kind of generate popular support for his programs. I don't know where the Biden presidency is going to go, but it seems to reinforce the notion that perhaps the modern presidency has evolved to the point where too much of the president's ability to get things done relies upon his ability to be this kind of national cheerleader. We'll look at that criticism and some of the issues of it. First, I'm going to start with a caution, and this is in the middle of page 4. That caution is this. You have to distinguish, and this isn't just criticism of the presidency, although because the presidency consists of a single president at any one time, you have to be careful about the kinds of criticisms that people make. Not only the presidency, but in general of the institutions, any institution, that they're not mistaking partisanship for the institution itself. And the examples I give in that paragraph in the middle of the notes on page 4, you have to be careful about the kinds of criticisms. Harry Reid was the majority leader of the Senate when the Democrats got the majority at both houses under President Obama's first election. In fact, they had a supermajority of 60 Democrats to 40 Republicans, and they won the majority in the House. And now, of course, they lost that in 2014 and 2016. And then they won it back in 2018. So on one level, Harry Reid, who was the majority leader, persuaded the Democrats in the Senate at that time to drop the filibuster for judicial nominations because the Republicans in the Senate were slowing down President Obama's Democratic nominations for the judiciary, etc. And then the problem is when the Republicans won the Senate back, they used that then to block Obama's when they were in the majority, and in some ways the same with judicial nominations under President Trump. And so on one level is the filibuster, and the whole question of the filibuster, which has become an object of Democratic criticism because there are 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats, and to pass major pieces of legislation, you have the filibuster being an obstruction to many aspects of progressive Democratic legislation. But the point is the same people who wanted to change the institution one way when they controlled the institution now don't like the things they were criticized, now don't like the things they advocated then. And it's the same with the president. You have to be careful. Sometimes people are making criticisms of the presidents because they don't like the president in power. So that's a critical thing you have to distinguish when you're actually criticizing the institution, is separate out your partisan embrace or support or criticism of the occupant or the party that controls the institution. Because ultimately you have to think like the founders. You have to think beyond party and partisanship and imagine human beings of any stripe occupying these institutions. That's what it means to be a founder or a designer of governing institutions. You have to imagine not only what the people who agree with you would do when they're in power, but what the people who disagree with you would do in power. And that's why the framers generally created a system which has held up pretty well after 250 years, because they seem to have a grasp on human nature. So, the specific criticisms: is the presidency too powerful? At the bottom of page 4. And partially this has to do with the rise of foreign affairs, the expansion of the war powers of the president. We kind of talked about that briefly in class on Wednesday, and the crisis power. And so the argument is here, I'll give an example. President Lincoln, during the Civil War, which was a crisis, by the way, President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, not only in the rebelling states, which of course we are at war with, technically, but in the northern states, when criticism of his conduct of the war effort tended to almost generate civil disobedience, like in states like Indiana, which of course was a northern state, was in the Union. So he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which in Article 1, Section 9 seems to be a congressional power. It says in Article 1, Section 9, which if you remember from our treatment of the Constitution, those are the limits on Congress's power. It says, nor shall the writ of habeas corpus be suspended except in times of insurrection and rebellion. Well, the Civil War was a time of insurrection and rebellion, and Lincoln suspended it. Now, he knew that probably wasn't constitutional in the sense that it seems to be Congress's decision. But then he actually argued that in this time of crisis, the emergency situation meant, first of all, the Constitution says that the writ of habeas corpus, which is essentially a protection that if you're arrested, a judge will issue a writ of habeas corpus to show a cause why you should remain in jail. It's a kind of a civil liberty and a protection that courts have against people arrested by the executive branch or the police. So Lincoln suspended it. Now, did he exceed the constitutional powers of the president? He argued that it was within the constitutional powers of the president because it was a time of crisis and he has the executive power, and it was a constitutional power anyway. But that's the question. By the end of the Vietnam War, which in class I explained led to the passage of the War Powers Act, which is discussed in Chapter 10, and you can actually read the War Powers Act of 1973. It's in the Nichols Reader if you want to read it. Many people thought that the presidency had escaped or transcended the constitutional ground and limits of the president's powers. In fact, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the historian, political scientist that I mentioned earlier, who commissioned this ranking and rating of presidents, which is now part of the scholarship of the presidency, actually wrote a book in 1974 called The Imperial Presidency, kind of suggesting that the modern president had become a kind of an emperor outside of and above constitutional powers, and therefore the Constitution, either there had to be an amendment or there had to be legislation which actually limited constitutional powers. So I mentioned that in the notes on the bottom of page 5, in the middle and bottom of page 5. And so the question is, has the president grown so powerful that we now have an elected emperor rather than a constitutional executive? Even after the controversy of President Trump, and President Biden has exercised some powers which some people criticize as unconstitutional. The vaccine mandate has actually, a court just last week, the Fifth Circuit Court, declared or put his vaccine mandate for companies over 100 employees on hold on the grounds that that may exceed the president's powers. President Trump tried to issue first a ban to travel from Muslim countries in the first months of his presidency, and the court struck it down, and eventually he came up with a travel ban that was based on 7 countries, not because of they're Muslims or the fact that of Muslim terrorists, but rather because of security concerns in those 7 countries. That was eventually upheld by the courts. My point here is that I think it can be argued that the modern president is not outside of constitutional restraints. Either the judiciary, through judicial review and the power to check executive actions, as every Supreme Court and lower judiciary, as we'll see, by the way, when we turn to the judiciary this coming weekend and the last of the course, the judiciary is a powerful check on the presidency. Moreover, as in response in class discussion about the War Powers Act, which assumed that Congress had the ability to tell the president to withdraw troops after 60 days through a congressional resolution, I argued that, siding actually with most presidents, both Democratic and Republican, that act was unconstitutional because it turns Congress into the commander-in-chief. That Congress has the power to restrain the president's military actions through its budgetary power. So the idea that the presidency is somehow, there's no question that the presidency is more powerful, undoubtedly, and that the presidency is probably more central and powerful in national, international affairs, and in public life and the constitutional system, more powerful than almost anyone except for Alexander Hamilton thought. But that doesn't mean that the president has transcended or escaped from the Constitution. The separation of powers and checks and balances